Hello, good morning. Thanks for having me. They told me there was going to be smoke bombs and all sorts of cool things going on here, but nothing. You're just left with me. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about building products for Fortune 100 companies as a startup. It's something I've made an art form of. So first off, who exactly am I and why should you listen to me? Honestly, you probably shouldn't, but you're here already, so we might as well just make use of our time. I founded a company called Flurry a long time ago, back in the early days of mobile, which was at the early stages of the mobile revolution of mobile apps. We grew it to being a large analytics provider. We sold it to Yahoo. I also started Outlier. We're at the forefront of using machine learning to inform business decisions using data. So I've started two companies that really founded in new categories of products that we sold to very large businesses in the Fortune 500. So I have done this before. I also invest in lots of companies, some of which sell to the Fortune 500. So I've seen this a lot. It doesn't mean I'm right. It also doesn't mean I know what I'm doing. But it does mean I didn't make all this up. So you have at least that going for me. So we're going to cover three things. The first is talking about customers and how they perceive products, which is a framework I think is really important as you're building a product because these enterprises see tons of things and you need to make sure you understand who's looking at your products. We'll talk about how to make your product stand out, all the design principles behind building products that will actually win in the market. And then finally, how do you actually reach your customer with your product when it's ready? Because it turns out products, we don't just put them in cannons and fire them out to customers. We actually have to design products for delivery and distribution. So let's get started. Let's talk about the first one. Are you new? Talking about the difference between new products and replacement products. So where do we start? In product management, in product design, product building, we always start with problems. That's how we start. If you start with a solution, then you have a destination, but the problem really is what drives us. It's what are we solving? Why does the product exist? What is it going to be used for? And so, for example, I might have a problem like customers lack the time to shop and cook, and there's lots of ways to solve that problem. I could solve it with a food delivery service like DoorDash, or a meal kit company like Blue Apron, or even restaurants and supermarkets. There's lots of ways to solve it. If I start with the problem, then I have a lot of options for solutions, and I can actually choose a solution that best fits the customer and the problem that I'm solving. If I start with the solution, which all too often actually happens, we have a product idea, a product we want to build, and then we go around looking for a problem to solve with it. We're essentially starting out with a hammer. So we want to start with the problem. We may also start with a problem like climate change, and the solution is, honestly, I have no idea. I hope somebody here figures it out, because somebody has to figure it out pretty soon. So you can either have problems that we've had since the beginning of time, or at least human history, and think about new solutions to it, or we can think about problems that may not have solutions. And those are the two different approaches that we have as startup companies building new products. You are not going to build the same thing that people are already buying, because obviously they're already buying it, it already exists in the world. So the question is, okay, if we're going to start with our problem, and it might be an existing problem or a new problem, what does this have to do with new categories of software? So here are three products and three new categories. We have mobile phones. When they first came out, they didn't have wires. I'm old enough to remember when phones had cables that came out of them, and that's not true anymore. This was a big deal. Because you didn't give up your old phone. I still had a phone at home that had a wire coming out of it. I just now had a mobile phone that didn't have a wire. And iPads, they weren't a laptop, but they also weren't a phone. They were somewhere in the middle. This is a whole new category of device that we're still trying to figure out what we use it for. And in the middle, we have smartphones. It actually was not a new category of phone. It wasn't actually a new category of product at all. There was a new category here. It was hiding on it the whole time, which was the App Store icon on the smartphones. So why is it that out of these, I'm saying that the smartphone is not a new product category? And this is a really important delineation to have for your products as you're building them for the Fortune 500, Fortune 100, Fortune 1000, is that the difference between being a replacement and a new category is important for your planning, and knowing the difference, even if it's shiny and new, is important. So why do I say that the smartphones here in the middle are not a new category? Well, I can prove it to you because they replaced something. They replaced existing feature phones. If you remember, in the early days of mobile, we were still walking into stores every 18 months and getting a new phone. And the carriers trained us to do that. That's how they locked us into longer-term contracts. And what happened one day is people started walking to those stores and walking out with smartphones. And so they were actually, the smartphone was replacing the feature phones. It wasn't a new product. I didn't have to make new room for it. I already had a phone. I was saying, here, take my feature phone and give me a smartphone. And you see the growth was very fast as a result. So what does it actually mean? What's the difference between new and replacement categories? So in a replacement product has existing budget. Somebody's already spending money on it. So you don't have to argue, hey, give me money. They already have money. They're already giving it. I already had a mobile phone. I was going to buy a new one anyway. I might as well put that towards my smartphone. And so the existing budget's already there. A new category, they might need new budget. You have to find a new way to pay for it. So where is that going to come from? What are you going to argue that they should spend more money on? In the case of enterprise software, this is hard because budgets get set and they may not be flexibility. Where is it going to come from? You have to be sure you understand. With a replacement product, you have an existing use case. They know what they use their CRM system for. They know what they use their accounting system for. They know what they use all these things for. With a new category of product, they might actually have no idea what they're going to use it for. And you have to help educate them as to how they're going to use it, because otherwise they're not going to go looking for it because they don't use it today. With an existing replacement product, you have known criteria because they are already using something. They know what they're looking for. They may even have these things called RFPs, which are horrible. Something was invented to torture us. In a new category, there are no RFPs because actually nobody has no idea what they're looking for yet. There may not actually be other products like yours in the market. Or if there are, they may not be easily compared because they have different approaches and different feature sets. And finally, a replacement product must be much better than the status quo because you're asking somebody to change. You need that activation energy to shift. Whereas a new category, I don't know. Nobody's any idea how good it has to be because they don't know what they're using it for yet. So what ends up happening, the reason it's so important to figure out which side of this you're on is that the way that you build your product, how it's evaluated by customers, is radically different. If you're a replacement product, there's a lot of things that are known. The budget, the use cases, the criteria. If you're a new category, there's a lot of education you have to do. You have to explain to people why they care. What are they going to use it for? How should they make a decision? Why should they choose you? What day is it? Where am I? What's going on? So there's a lot of things going on in this, but if I decide which side I fit on, a lot of my future product decisions will fall out of that, and I'll be much more successful in selling it. Now, this isn't just true of phones, although it is true of phones. We're here talking about B2B stuff. So let's talk about B2B. This is an example of the difference between new and replacement products. This is Siebel Systems. Does anybody remember Siebel? Yes, good. I'm not the only old person. Excellent. Very good. So Siebel was one of the first CRMs. This is Salesforce, which was a replacement product. And the reason I know it's a replacement product is that if you used Salesforce back then, they literally photocopied the Siebel interface on a website. They didn't even try to change it. It wasn't even subtle. It was literally a photocopy. It was amazing. But it wasn't a website. This is desktop software, and this was a website. And the idea was you'd pay for Salesforce. You don't install software. It could be cheaper. It was a replacement. There was existing budget, existing criteria, existing use cases. All that was there. It turns out, though, this new versus replacement situation is not static, because it turned out Salesforce had created a new category. We just had no idea at the time, and those buyers weren't buying because it was new. They were buying a replacement, but it was SaaS software, software as a service. And it became a new category, and it wasn't at first, but eventually did. And what was the change, and how do I know that it eventually shifted from a replacement to a new category? Because this is what it looks like today. This is what Salesforce looks like today, and this is, that was actually a screenshot from today from Siebel. It hasn't changed in 20 freaking years. I have no idea what's going on there. Basically, the idea is SaaS software can evolve and improve because it's web-based, it's continually updating, the interfaces improve. And so the fact that you think you know where your product fits on this new versus replacement spectrum, it may change over time. You have to be well aware of how the market around you is changing. A product that's new category today can become a replacement tomorrow if the market has a lot of competition that flows in. A product that's a replacement may actually turn into a new category if your approach is so different that it unlocks future capabilities down the road. Now, why is all this true? Why do we ask this question about new versus replacement? I keep harping on it. I'm wasting your time. I sure as hell better have a good reason for wasting your time. I confess that I probably don't, but anyway, again, we're already here. It's because the customers that you're selling to are going to differ as well. So it's not just the criteria, it's who's going to buy it. This is Geoffrey Moore's model of new technology adoption, which, by the way, was, I don't know, God, when did he publish that? The late 90s? This is a long time ago. But this is the chasm model. The idea is that a new technology goes through early adoption, through innovators and early adopters, and then you jump over the chasm to the mass market, the mainstream market, as it becomes more widely adopted, and eventually it just becomes something everybody has. Now, the reason this model is important is that if you are a new product category, you're selling to the early market. You're selling to people who are early adopters. Those people adopt new things sometimes just because they're new, right? They like new things. They want to adopt new things. They have incentive to change. Maybe the incentive is that they're curious, or maybe the incentive is that their business is on fire and they need to do something differently. If you are selling a replacement product, you're typically selling over here to the mainstream market. These are value-driven buyers, people who have criteria. They care about ROI. They care about things that are very specific, very structured. They want to make decisions on their schedule. They may not have a large incentive to change. And so if you mix it up, if you try to sell a new product category to the mainstream or a replacement product to the early adopters, you actually may have a big impedance mismatch in terms of the companies, the customers, the buyers, who they are, in addition to the criteria we talked about before. So understanding whether or not you're a new or replacement category is important because it means it helps inform who your customers will be. And that's all I'm talking about in terms of customers, because this is a product conference. We should talk about products. Products are very exciting. So let's get to that. Let's talk about how you stand out in the crowd. And I'll talk about some very important design principles that I have found in my experience, which again is my experience, that are really important to make sure you are successful in this world. And why is it important? Your product is one of tens of thousands of products, and that is not bad, it is just how it is. There's lots of us creating products in the world, and the internet is an amazing equalizer. Everybody can create products everywhere. So if you are one of tens of thousands of products, how in the world do we stand out in a world that we might drown? So I think there's three things that you need. One is visible differentiation, the second is low effort adoption, the third is flexibility. What do those things mean? I will go through them now and explain them. Let's start off with visible differentiation. You have 30 seconds for your product to defy categorization. 30 seconds does not seem like a long time. Defying categorization seems really hard. There's lots of products in the world. But I can prove it to you that this is the case, and I will do that right now. What is this? That's a car. I didn't have to ask you. You knew that was a car. You saw that it was a car. What is this? That is also a car. It's a Tesla. So if you were to peel off the frame and the outside, it doesn't look anything like the first car underneath. But it looks like a car. So we look at it. It's a car. It has a windshield. It has doors. It has a steering wheel. What is this? You've never seen it before, but you immediately were like, it's a car. And then you were like, well, if it's a car, where are the doors? And where's the windshield? And where's the steering wheel? And where are all those car things that cars are supposed to have? Even though you've never seen it before, you don't know what it is, you don't know what it's for, you think that it's a car. Okay, one more time. What is this? I guarantee you've never seen it before. This is a gyroscopic stabilizer for people who have hand tremors. Now, you've never seen it before, so the first thing that happened when you saw that photo was you started to do critical thinking. You tried to figure out what it was and how you might use it and where might have you seen it before. That feeling of critical thinking is what you need your customers to do. If they pattern match you and say you're a car, they will start to bring criteria to you that they bring to cars. They will ask where your windshield is, where are your doors and your steering wheel, which may not be relevant criteria at all. They may not have anything to do with what you're doing, but people are typically pattern matching. We use pattern matching to deal with noise. If there are tens of thousands of products, it's easier to pigeonhole you and apply known criteria than think critically. So how do you beat that? Well, if you look like something they haven't seen before, if you defy categorization, you can break free of that and activate critical thinking. When they see your product in those first 30 seconds, if it doesn't look like what they've seen, if they can't successfully pigeonhole you and say that it's a car, all of a sudden now they're thinking critically. They're listening to what you're saying, and they'll think about the merits and the arguments that you have. And that lock, whether or not you're able to break that lock, is driven by your product. It's not your sales pitch, not your marketing, because everybody has those. That's how you get the attention of the customer. When you have the attention, those first 30 seconds of the product determine whether or not they will use critical thinking or not with your product. So you have to think about this. It does require you to work harder. It is easier to make things that look like other things. It's easier to build a CRM system that looks like Salesforce. I realize that. I get it. But in doing so, you're not necessarily going to activate critical thinking. You will find yourself in RFP hell through all sorts of strange buying processes. So you have 30 seconds to defy categorization because it's going to unlock critical thinking in your customers, which is what we need. We are startup companies. If we can't activate critical thinking, we cannot win in other dimensions of the business. The existing incumbents have too much power, money, distribution, boredom, people, I don't know, whatever. Okay, that's visible differentiation. By the way, if you disagree on all that, on this stuff, that's cool. But I'm up here and I have a microphone, you don't, so. Okay, so low effort adoption, what do I mean? The longer it takes to adopt a product, the less likely it is to be adopted. So why is it that I think that? This is the model of skepticism. It had animation in my version, but you have to deal with the fact that it doesn't have animation here. So when you have a new idea, something new, You start off being like, wow, that is awesome. This is exciting. This new AI-activated drone latte system is the best thing I've ever seen. And over time, if I have to wait to get it, if I've seen it, but I need to deploy it because it has to go through legal and it has to go through some sort of sales engineering effort, and then I'm like, actually, do I really need a latte delivered by an AI drone? And it takes a little bit longer, and you're like, actually, you know, my latte machine's like just 10 steps over there. I can actually walk over and get it. And eventually you're down here and you're like, actually, I have a lot of other things to do. I can't deal with this new thing. So the longer that it takes for you to deploy and show value from this thing that captured the imagination of this buyer, the less likely it is that they are going to have the activation energy to adopt it. So, and I say this in an enterprise software world where our typical time to value is measured in months, sometimes 6 months. It's amazing. One thing I did at Outlier was make sure our time to value is measured in a day. So the customer gets a value in a day, 2 days, immediately. Because if you do that, you actually capture the wow. You've captured the confidence in the new idea. And especially in new categories of products, you need that excitement. That excitement is a core part of why you will overcome all that skepticism. And if you wait too long, and there's always good reasons why it takes longer, like, oh, you know, our sales engineering experience is great, or we need to derive more business rules, or we have to collect more requirements. There's always reasons it can take longer, but the longer it takes, the less likely it is you capture that magic, and the less likely it is you'll jump over that skepticism gap. And so if you can reduce the effort to adoption and make it super fast, you can grow a lot faster. Because again, you're fighting the status quo. And the status quo is a very powerful thing because everybody shows up every day, they do their job, and they go home. And that is actually not so bad. So if you want to change them, you need an activation energy to get them out of it. Flexibility. So you can either sell a new category of product, or you can tell the customer how to use it. You can't have everything. So why is that? Well, this was my calendar recently. I'm pretty busy. It turns out. If you were to tell me I have to find 30 minutes every day to use your product, I will just start laughing and then do something else because I'm busy. And especially if you told me I had to take 30 minutes every day at 9 a.m. to use your product, I will again hang up because I don't have time to deal with that. The reality is, if you have a product and you're trying to fit into somebody's day, you have to earn the right to fit into their day. Even if you're a replacement product, you can't necessarily assume that your brand new CRM system will be able to occupy the same time that a Salesforce CRM system is. It's just not that simple. And so how do you earn your way into somebody's day? How do you build these habit-forming products? You have to be flexible. You have to fit into their day the way that they want you to fit in. You have to be able to fill in those gaps and be something that is easier to adopt. So if you're prescriptive in the fact that you have to use it this way and do this and do that, you're going to end up in a world where your customers can't contort themselves enough to be able to adopt your products. So, since you can't do both, you have to choose. And often, almost always, we're really pushing something new, and so we have to be flexible. We have to fit into the customer how they want to use it, which of course is in some ways the best kind of customer feedback and the best kind of product research is watching how people decide to use your product rather than how we thought they might use your product. Very cool. So we've talked about thinking about who our customer is. We've thought about our products and how they work and how to design them. Let's finish off by talking about how do we reach them. Because again, we don't put products into cannons and shoot them at customers. It would actually be a lot easier if that's how it worked, although more violent. Let's talk about reaching customers. So I am a firm believer that your product actually determines which channels you can use to reach customers. It is not the fact that we build a product and then we throw marketing at it, or we have a sales team, and that's just not the way the world works. The reality is how you build your product determines how you can reach that customer. So what do I mean? So think about something called product channel fit that I just made up. So if you're going to use performance marketing, like Facebook ads and Google ads, somebody's going to click on something, you better have some kind of self-service experience to capture them in that moment, because if you're just having people do performance advertising clicks to, I don't know, watch a video or see some of your PDF brochures, it's not going to work very well. If you are using value-added resellers, you better have some extensibility in your product, because otherwise there's no value to add, and your value-added resellers aren't going to give you the time of day. They're not going to pay attention. Finally, if you plan to deploy against a software marketplace like Salesforce's app marketplace, well, you sure as hell better integrate with them, because if you don't, you won't be on that marketplace. So how you build your product and some of the core features it will have are going to be based on how you reach your customers. And how you reach your customers is going to be limited by whether or not your product supports these features. So this is not something you do later. This is something you have to think about on day one. So as a result, you have to work backwards. You start with your customer, you think about how they discover products, how do they adopt products, and you build your product to optimize for those channels, because then you can actually reach them when your product is done being built. Always the best thing. So how do people know you exist? Even if you've designed for channels, people have to know you're out there, because you can't just like stuff it through a channel and have it come out the other end. The problem here is, you know, if you're faced with a Google search bar, how is somebody going to search for your product? Because they don't know it exists, because we're startup companies, we just got started. We don't have brand names people recognize. And especially if you're in a new product category, how do they describe it? How do they know to describe a product that they haven't seen before? Imagine our gyroscope example. How would you describe it? You've now seen it for about 30 seconds. You'd come up with a bunch of ways to describe it. In fact, everybody in this room would probably describe it differently. And that isn't useful in a search box if everybody is searching for something different. If you don't believe me, these are the ways that a bunch of well-known brands, these are the founders of these companies, this is how they describe their products when they launched. I hope we can agree these are not good descriptions of what they do. And if these are the founders, the people who designed the products and built them and rolled them out, imagine what the customers are writing about them all over the place. And so it almost becomes impossible. By the way, this description of Twitter is actually horrific. I don't know if you've seen it. It's just not even what it does today. So what do you do? How do you deal in a world where there's just such wide diversity in how people are talking about it? How can people find you? How can they find your products? Well, the good news is, going back and circling the loop, we actually started with a problem, and people can describe problems. And so they will describe what you do by describing the problem that they have. And if you started by solving a problem, hopefully a lot of people have it, that is how they'll describe it, and that's how they will find you, and that's how you will reach them. You won't talk about your product. You will talk about the problem. Or, even better, if you actually have visible differentiation, if you have low effort adoption, if you are flexible, your customers will want to talk about you, because it's a really cool new thing that's easy to adopt, that gives you a lot of value, and so they will spread the word for you. And it is much better for somebody to tell their friends to check something out, because they will have a minute or two to explain it, whereas you may have a sentence or two. So overall, the focus is not on you, it's on your customers and their problems, and that's how you end up bridging that gap. Okay, let's bring it home. Sean's been up on stage talking for a while. What exactly he's been talking about, and what do I take away from this, other than the fact that he tells bad jokes and he likes to pace up and down the stage? I think that there's 3 keys to successfully selling to Fortune 500 customers, and that font is amazing. That's not the font that I chose, but anyway, there's 3 things. First, be obviously visibly different. You need to defy categorization, because if you don't, you will get pigeonholed. People will start looking at you like you're a car and ask where your windshield is, where are your doors, where's your steering wheel. You need to be amazingly easy to adopt, because if you're not, skepticism kicks in. It can be hard to overcome that skepticism gap, and the status quo ends up ruling the day. And finally, you have to work backwards from your customer. Think about how they discover products. How do they describe the problem that you solve? If you work backwards from them, you end up in a world where your product is now genetically designed to be able to reach them effectively, solve their problems, and grow on its own, which of course is always why we do this, is we want people to use our products. So that's what I had to talk about. I am open to any questions that you might have. If your question is why my sense of humor is so poor, unfortunately I can't answer that. Excellent. Do we have to wait for the microphones, or can we just ask questions?
What, if you apply the principles that you have there to Flurry, what would you say worked at Flurry, and what would you say you could have followed up with that exact advice?
Yeah. So the question was, the question was, how does this apply to Flurry? My experience with Flurry, which is the first company I started. So we'll go through that in order. So first off, in terms of low effort adoption. Flurry was an analytics service. You had to build it into your app, which means you had to download an SDK and integrate it. I spent 6 months obsessing over that process. I was obsessed with how easy you could make it for somebody to sign up, download the SDK, and get it running in their app. And the reason I obsessed about it was I was a firm believer that there was a lot of skepticism about using third-party services. This is the early days of mobile apps. The idea of downloading an SDK and integrating to your app was a big deal. Right? You were using maybe some of the Apple libraries, maybe some of the Android libraries. And so I obsessed to make it as easy as possible, so there's no reason not to try it. And we spent a lot of work just removing small little steps, getting it down to one line of code to add into your app. It required an enormous amount of engineering on this weird, quest that I was on for my white whale of reducing it. And at the end, we had the easiest to integrate SDK in mobile applications. Now, the interesting thing was I assumed, Flurry was a free service, by the way, so everybody could go download it and use it. I was like, all our competition will just copy it, and so it's a head start, right? Everybody else will learn from this, but at least it's a head start, and we'll figure out something else. And 6 years later, I didn't touch it for 6 years, and 6 years later, it was still the easiest to integrate SDK. And what I realized was that low effort adoption had become a barrier and a wall, because nobody else realized how important it was to overcome that skepticism gap. So that was one example. The second example I'll use from Flurry is going back to visible differentiation, was that the way people thought about analytics before mobile apps was web-based, page views, these sorts of things. In fact, some of the very first customers of Flurry asked how they measured page views in their mobile app, which is a very weird and silly conversation we had. So the very first thing when you signed up for Flurry, it showed you were metrics that were very specific to apps. They were not things you were used to seeing from your website. It very specifically was like, well, what the hell is a session? Like, what are these things? Why are you showing me? It activated critical thinking because they weren't the metrics. It would be easier to have created a proxy for what a page view was and make your app look like a website. But by defining it, we forced you to think critically about the fact that your app is very different. Good question.
You mentioned that with Outlier, you've got time to value down to 1 day. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you went about that, what that looks like?
I did exactly the same thing. I obsessed about the day zero experience, because the world of AI today, while it's very hot in our technology circles, many people in the world are skeptical about AI. They're afraid of what it might mean for their jobs, or they don't know that it works. And so I realized early on that a product like Outlier, which was going to use machine learning to automate business analysis, to look through your data like a human, people were going to be skeptical that it worked. And the only way to convince them was to make there no reason you wouldn't try it and see for yourself. So we spent a lot of time. So today, you connect Outlier to your data wherever it is. Maybe it's in the Salesforce, the Adobe Cloud, or in Facebook ads, or Zendesk, or in SQL databases. And it just takes a click to add a data source, and you begin to get insights the next day. So it's very fast. It required an enormous amount of engineering, research, statistics, data science to be able to make that happen. The amount that, again, just like my Flurry days, most people would look at and say it was unreasonable and ridiculous to spend that much effort on it. But I stand by it because today, a Fortune 500 customer can be up and running with Outlier immediately. Typically, the integration takes 10 minutes. They begin to get insights immediately. And so that response overcomes that skepticism gap in artificial intelligence in a way that nothing else I could do, no marketing collateral, no sales pitch could ever do for me. And it was worth it in the end. Now, is it a head start, or will people copy it? I don't know. I will tell you from my Flurry experience, I tend to think things are head starts when they're big barriers, and maybe vice versa for all I know. But for now, I think that the key aspect is that if you have a new product category like ours, the best argument, the best spokesperson for it is the product itself. And if the product can speak quickly, then you can capture that magic. And we do. I mean, I'll tell you, people feel like it's magic to add their data and find insights the next day. It feels magical, even though it's mathematics. And that's something that you can't, there's no other way to get it.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. Mm-hmm. I have one question about the new category and existing category, and then tie it back with the customer problems. Mm-hmm. This is my understanding is that for the new category, usually because we focus on like new customer problem or like the problems that we foresee that customer will have. Mm-hmm. So that in that sense, that can you share some of the lessons that whether is the market is ready for kind of like new category, and when like all the technologies around complementary technologies is ready for us to kind of like work on the new category?
It's a great question, and I think that this is something that always bothers me. Is like there's a term in marketing called demand generation. Have you ever heard of this? Which is ridiculous because you can't generate demand. That's not something you do. Like it either exists or it doesn't, and you can tap into it, but you can't give somebody demand. And I think that that's true in new product categories. Even though people might not imagine the product, you can't win if people don't know they have the problem, right? And if they don't, and they have to have the problem and also wanting to solve it. So let's say, hypothetically, let's say my hair was on fire, right? And you're like, Sean, your hair's on fire, let's put it out. And my response is, my hair's not on fire. What are you talking about? That's my hair's on fire. If you have to convince me I have this problem, you're already losing. There's just not enough time and resources in the world. But let's assume I'm like, yeah, my hair's on fire, but you know it's cold out today, so it's actually pretty nice. So I actually have to know I have the problem, but also want to solve it, right? In fact, a lot of problems you will find are preserving somebody's job, right? Somebody has a job because there's friction in their business. And if you're like, I'm going to sell you a solution, and they're like, I like my job, I'm not letting you get rid of my job, you will also fail. So just because it's a problem that people have and they know they have, it doesn't mean they want to get rid of it. The final part is it has to be something that's very urgent. You could be like, Sean, your hair's on fire. I'm like, yeah, I should probably put it out, but I got stuff to do. I'll do it next week. If there's no urgency to it, then your sales cycles get so long that the business can't grow, right? So the key thing about a new product category is, do people acknowledge they have the problem? Like you should ask them, do you have this problem? And they should be like, oh my God, I do. It's horrible. And you should ask, would you like a solution? They're like, do you have anything at all? Because if you have those two things, everything else takes care of itself. Can you build products and sell products if that's not the case? You can. It's just a lot harder, and why make it harder than it already is? Because it's already really, really, really hard. Cool. More questions. These are good. Ask me some hard ones. Oh, there's one in the back there. I'll do jazz hands while we wait. Everybody's like, why am I listening to this guy who does jazz hands on stage?
Hi, thank you for your speech. And I had a question. Are there any companies that you have your eye on that you feel that they're doing a really good job of creating a product and then rolling it out, and we can kind of watch how they do it and maybe kind of learn from what they're doing?
That's an interesting question. So companies that I think we can all learn from in terms of how they roll their products out. I think that the challenge, so this is an important nuance, which is that what we see from the outside of a company rolling out products is very different than what they're doing internally. I think the best companies make it seem like a well-orchestrated ballet, while on the inside everything is on fire, right? And so it's really hard to tell whether or not success happens by accident or on purpose. And so it's really hard to decide who to take guidance from, right? I will say that there are some models where people have been successful for long enough that clearly they know what they're doing. So let's look at Amazon Web Services, right? Amazon Web Services was a great platform that started, if you remember, in the early days with S3. All you could do is store some sort of binary in a bucket. And that was all it did. And you could just do it on the command line. It was very limited. And then they added EC2, which was running a server in the cloud. And they have, like clockwork, added more and more services. But if you look at it, they were creating a topology of use cases that all meshed together. They were building from the bottom up. They were learning from customers, watching how people use their products, and adding features and new products that filled in those gaps. So they started small, and they built an ecosystem around it. And they were very methodical about doing it. And only doing it, they thought they could do it very well. And if they couldn't do it well, bringing in partners and such to do it. So I think that, if you look at the history of Amazon Web Services from the beginning, and that's a very good example. I think that in the consumer world, everybody looks to Apple for great product development. I think the problem is Apple's model, I don't think would work for anyone else. I think that anybody else trying to do it, the problem is a lot of the secret to Apple isn't their product development process. It's their consumer base that they have built and grown over 40 years. Like it's, not 40 years, but a long time. Because that is the secret to their success. They have a built-in, like that chasm model that I talked about from Jeffrey Moore doesn't apply to Apple. Like people don't realize that's the genius of their business. They don't have to cross the chasm. They built bridges across the chasm that they can run freaking trailer trucks across. Like they have an ingenious business, but I don't know that it's portable elsewhere. And so it's really hard to find overall companies that have had continued success. I will say that one of the companies that I think is most interesting overall is Nike, which I know is not a software platform. But the great thing about Nike that I find so fascinating is that they sell shoes, but you don't buy shoes from Nike. You buy a lifestyle. And they have found a way to create an ecosystem of products that reinforce that idea and that community, which is a really good way of thinking about all our products, because if we sell hammers, hammers are cheap, right? But if you sell home improvement, the idea that your home can be better, people love that, right? There's no ceiling on how much you'll pay for a better home, a better environment to be in, but you're probably not going to pay more than $3 or $4 for a hammer, right? So that idea of making sure you cast yourself in terms of a larger a larger emotional response is a great product development strategy and something that I think does work at scale. But honestly, I spend so much time building my own products, I'm not a good person to ask. It turns out if you're working on building products at a startup company, you're pretty busy. At least I am. I don't know about you. Do we have time for any more? Are we done? No? Yes? More questions? Okay.
There you go. My question is around the new product versus existing product, but what about if you're dealing with a new industry completely? How does that shift that? Because if you're dealing with a new industry, then kind of all the products for the industry are, even if they exist in other industries, are being adapted for that industry. So
that is a good point. So what about new industries, things that haven't existed before? And we've seen the eruption of new industries like crypto and all sorts of other ones. I will say that two things. The people who work in new industries are not new people. They're people who have worked other places. It's not a coincidence that most always when you're starting something new, you're using the tools you used to use because that's what you're used to, at least some familiarity. You can't build everything from scratch, from the ground up. It's just not feasible. You can't reinvent economies. So there are always going to be something that they view as how they work. It just is how it will be. The question ends up being, are you going to be a replacement to their perception of what they need, or are you a new product in terms of how you approach it, right? And so, for example, let's say you have something new in a new industry where everything is new, which is great because it's a green field. Like mobile apps with Flurry was great because every mobile app developer was starting from scratch. Nobody had built mobile apps before, so they didn't have an existing analytics solution, for example. They didn't have something in place. We didn't have to go tear out another solution. Flurry was typically the very first thing they integrated into their apps. However, they had used analytics before, and they knew what they thought those things did. And so it ended up being, depending on the customer, they either would see it as a replacement for tools they were used to on the web, or an entirely new category because they were building apps from the ground up. And in the early days of mobile, you actually saw that happen. There were app developers who built apps that were their website, basically. And they were not very good apps. And there were people who really tried to innovate. One of the first really popular apps, I don't know if y'all remember, was the Zippo lighter app. You remember that one? Where you like flick your finger and the lighter would light up? And the reason that was popular, it was doing something you couldn't do in a website. It was reacting to gesture touch in your phone. And so that was a company, that was a brand that was thinking about it as new. Apps were new, they were different. Whereas the companies building their websites and apps, that was replacements. It was something that existed. This is just a new version of my website. And so it can depend across the board about how the bias that the existing people working there bring with them. And understanding that is actually probably more important than how you perceive the market. And it won't be consistent across the board. The great thing about new industries is everything gets to be thrown up in the air and revisited. The problem is it all happens at once. And so there's a lot less consistency.
Well,
Next.
thank you so much, John. I think
Thank
we're
you
good
very
with
much.
questions.